is Andreas Kapsner. I'm here on behalf of the Mexican logic teaching network Lógica MX, and the organizers of this video series, Martina Martinez and Gabriel Ramos, have asked me to produce one of two videos on Connexive Logic. The first of these videos will be prepared by Luis Estrada, and you should watch that first because it contains the background knowledge that I will presume for this video. This video is concerned more with the philosophical aspects that I think are interesting about Connexive Logic. But the organizers have asked me not to get straight to the point, but first introduce myself and tell you a bit more about myself. I've been fortunate that I've been able to do academic work on a variety of subjects. I have a background in cognitive science. I've worked on analytical aspects of Buddhist philosophy, on political philosophy, on legal epistemology, but all these things aside, I would say my main focus in my research is at the intersection of the philosophy of language and the philosophy of logic. And there I am mostly concerned with non-classical logics and their applications, how they play into language analysis and other applications. I've worked on paraconsistent logics, relevant logics, constructive logics, and over the years I've always been interested in connexive logic as well. So with that, we are now arriving at our topic. You will have gathered that connexive logic is mainly characterized by two principles called Aristotle's thesis and Boethius' thesis. There are other principles, but I would say that really the consensus right now is that the core of connexive logic is contained in these two principles. You will have gathered from watching Lewis's video that these are not valid in classical logic, and if you ask for the validity of these principles, you're entering the world of contra-classical logics. And these are quite special in the family of non-classical logics, because most non-classical logics are sublogics of classical logic. And as a topic in the philosophy of logic, this is extremely interesting, just because it gives you a very different pattern from the usual in the realm of non-classical logics. I don't have time to go into any of that, but the one thing that I want to single out here is that, to my mind at least, if you are coming from the kind of background that I'm coming from, if you are after these kind of goals of applying logic to language analysis, I would say in the realm of contra-classical logics, connexive logics are really the only family of logics that have a really strong intuitive foundation and motivation. You might disagree with that, but I think the other contra-classical logics are way behind in intuitive force here. And so I want to start out with talking a bit about these intuitions that are driving, to my mind, driving connexive logic, and which as philosophers we should really focus on. Now, if you show, for example, Aristotle's thesis, I will concentrate on that because it's just easier to talk about, because it's less complicated syntactically. If you look again at Aristotle's thesis, really, most students of logic, when you have walked them through the first course of classical logic, look at that and they've learned how to read the symbols, and they say, well, this is clearly true. And almost all of them really have to be shown the truth tables of classical logic to see that this is actually not valid in classical logic. It looks so obviously true. However, if you translate it into some kind of a natural language analog, then you end up with something like, it is not the case that if A, then not A, which is a bit of a complicated thing to say. So what I think shines through this this immediate feeling of, oh, this must be valid, is actually an intuition about the embedded conditional. It can never be right to say something like, if A is the case, then not A is the case. So I would say, as a philosopher of language, my interest in connexive logic is first and foremost to do some kind of justice to these kinds of intuitions. And they just haven't received enough attention, I would say, at least until the interest in connexive logic really picked up pace over the last maybe 15, 20 years. Now, if you want to address these intuitions, there are different ways to do it, and it's not completely clear from the outset that logic actually is the tool to address these kind of intuitions. So one thing you might want to try to do with these intuitions is to explain them by an appeal to pragmatics. So the general idea would be something very similar to what Grice was doing, even though he didn't have this particular application of his pragmatic theory of language in mind. But it would be to say, well, these things, even though they look like they should be valid, Aristotle's thesis, Boethius' thesis, they are not, but I give you a pragmatic explanation of why they appear to be valid. And that will progress by actually finding a pragmatic fault with the embedded conditionals. So with the, in the case of Aristotle's thesis, with if A then not A, I will give you a pragmatic story about conditionals that will show that if A then not A might be true, but it is always unassertable on pragmatic grounds. Here's a second idea what you could do. You could reach for a psychological theory in the psychology of reasoning that explains why we have these strong intuitions, but they are actually mistaken. We should do some kind of justice to these intuitions. That doesn't necessarily mean, at least to my mind, that we have to explain them to be correct. It could also be, well, they are actually incorrect intuitions, but here is an explanation, and that is missing so far, why everyone thinks they are correct. So, maybe there's something there to be had. Maybe some kind of idea about heuristics that attached to conditionals might work. Some kind of modification of mental model theory, maybe. If that is your area of research, I think there's a lot of interesting things to be explored there. But thirdly, and that is, I think, the interest of most people in the connexive logic community, is to find a logical solution by finding, a connexive logic. I have urged that to actually find a logic that does justice to these intuitions, you have to have these validities that I've shown, Aristotle's thesis and Boethius' thesis, but you also have to make sure that things like if A then not A is never satisfiable in any of your models. So that is the idea in the very short paper called Strong Connexivity. That leads us directly to the next problem area, the next philosophical question here, and that is whether there might be some restrictions that it might be natural to apply to the connexive principles. Because it turns out that it looks very hard to find a suitable connexive logic in all generality, especially if you share my intuition about strong connexivity, about the unsatisfiability of things like if A, then not A. And it might just be easier to get a suitable logic if you relax the requirements in a certain way. And most attention here has been on the possibility of asking the connexive principles not for each and every instance, but only those that have possible or non-contradictory antecedents in their conditionals. So the thought is, once you get a conditional that is impossible in some sense, if 2 + 2 is 5, then, whatever holds or doesn't hold, things get intuitively a little bit more hazy. And the idea would be to say, well, if we cannot get a connexive logic that holds in these kind of cases, maybe that's all right, or maybe even that's desirable. Some people have the more radical view that the connexive principles should fail for counterpossibles. My own view is less radical. It's not that I'm against finding a logic that is unrestrictedly connexive. I would, just be satisfied for my purposes to find a logic that is connexive under these kind of restrictions. The main point in my paper called Humble Connexivity is that those people who share this kind of intuition should be aware that even if you only ask for connexivity in this kind of restricted sense, you still have a lot of work to do. It's not completely trivial, because what I had the feeling was that the usual dialectics was, these kind of things, Aristotle's thesis, that might look really compelling, but just think if A is a contradiction in here. The instance of A, make that a contradiction, and all plausibility goes away, and so we don't need to think about this any further. And my paper one of the main points it's trying to make is that this is actually too quick, that even restricted connexivity needs a lot of work. Okay. Now, so assuming that we've decided what we actually want to achieve in terms of the kind of principles we're asking for, we should then also be aware of the fact that a lot of interest that the area of conditionals holds for philosophers is that there are so many kinds of conditionals that are clearly related but also clearly different in nature. And when you phrase the principles we started out with, just using arrows, it's not quite clear which kind of conditional or conditional-like entity we might mean. So, just to give you a sample of things that are usually thought of when you're thinking of conditionals, there are indicative conditionals and there are subjunctive conditionals, counterfactual conditionals, if you think that these are different things than subjunctive conditionals. There are causal conditionals, and so on. So we might ask ourselves, for which kind of conditional should we ask these principles to hold? Which ones might fail? Maybe. And if you take a look back at Boethius, there's actually 3 different conditionals in there, or potentially different conditionals there. If you have a language now that has, for example, an indicative and a counterfactual conditional, well, you have a lot of combinations here. It could be that the main connective is indicative, but the other ones are counterfactual. So this is a short paper with Hitoshi Omori that is just making this point, that there's actually quite a few different variations to look through and to ask ourselves, which ones do we actually want in our Connexive logic? Which ones do we need? Which ones are optional? And which ones might actually not be desirable? And this actually goes beyond conditionals in that it also applies to conditional-like entities. Like, for example, entailment. There are versions that talk about entailment with regards to Aristotle and Boethius. There's actually now a lot of interesting work coming out that is looking at connexive principles in the realm of belief revision operators. I think it's really useful, and we can still learn a lot by asking ourselves what the exact relationship is between connexive logic and other prominent fields in the philosophy of logic. And this is, by asking about this relationship, we can learn, I think, much about connexive logic, but we can also learn much about these other ideas in philosophical logic by looking through that particular lens that connexive logic gives us. So there's really a lot that I could point you to. I just picked some things to give you a start. Well, obviously, Aristotle and Boethius are called as they are because people thought that there's some connection to the history of logic here. And I'm not a historian of logic and have important language deficiencies to be an effective one. But it is really fascinating to read through some of the classic texts and have this as a focal point. Coming more to the modern period, there are all kinds of non-classical logics that you could try to combine with connexive ideas and see what happens on the one hand. And on the more philosophical and conceptual level, you can ask, well, these have motivations. Do they go against the motivations of connexive logics, or do they go together? You can ask that about relevant logic. Much of the research has been in close proximity to relevant logic. But still, it's not clear to me what the exact core that both share is or is supposed to be. And furthermore, if it's actually formally achievable to have these motivations together. Starting with Heinrich Wansing, there has been a lot of interest in the interplay between constructive logics, especially in the family of Nelson logics, and connexive logics. And again, we can ask philosophical questions about that relationship. And one will, I think, inevitably be, at the end of the day, we will have to make some kind of cost-benefit analysis here. I'm pretty sure, as always in logic, that we won't be able to get everything we want. So with that, I conclude my personal view on some of the interesting philosophical questions that we can ask in this field. I hope that I've been able to convey that there's really a lot to be explored here, but also that it's interesting and worthwhile to be doing it. And maybe some of you who are watching this will soon join the growing community of connexive researchers. Thank you very much.